welcome to what is probably our last notes on evolution. And it is really about all of the other ways that a population can change besides natural selection. But first, let's get into the effect that natural selection has on a population. What you see in front of you is called a normal distribution curve. This basically shows that if you put all of the traits and graph them on a curve, you would see most traits in a population fall under the average, while there are less at the extremes. The classic example of this is height. Most people are between like 5'5" and let's say 6 feet tall, and those people fall in this mean or average, while there are very few people smaller than 5'5" and very few people taller than 6 feet, right? Frequencies decrease as you go towards the extremes. This is what you would see if you look at most traits. The largest number of individuals in the median or middle, and a few people or a few species on the extreme. Well, now let's look at the effect that natural selection can have on the distribution of this normal distribution curve. Traits not undergoing natural selection will look like this, but traits undergoing natural selection can have three different paths that they take. The first one is called directional selection, where one phenotype is favored, one of the extremes is favored over the other type. So an example for this could be a species of birds. Let's say that in the ecosystem where the birds live in, only large seeds are produced by the trees. And so what happens over a few generations is only birds with large beaks will be able to break those large seeds. And so the original population will shift towards members of the population having that extreme trait of larger beaks. And so the new population shifts in one direction towards the large beaks. Directional selection can happen towards either of the extremes, but it shifts the population in one direction or the other. That's directional selection. Stabilizing selection basically favors the intermediate phenotype. Again, the intermediary traits. Classic example for this is birth weight in humans. Generally, babies born with a low weight lose heat more quickly, can get ill from infectious diseases more easily, and die at a higher rate. And babies with large body weight make it more difficult to deliver them through the pelvis. And so generally, infants with the medium weight survive more often than the larger or smaller babies, and their mortality rate is much higher. And so this is an example where you see stabilizing selection, where the two extremes, low birth weight and high birth weight, are selected against, and the intermediary is selected for. This is called stabilizing selection. The final one is called disruptive selection. Disruptive selection selects against the mean or the average phenotype. There are a few different examples. The one in here that I have is about a population of rabbits where there are gray, black, and white. And if they're all interspersed in one area, generally the gray phenotype would be the average, right? Because it's a mix of the white and black, leading to gray rabbits. But if there's a population of those rabbits where they are living in an area where there's black rocks and white sand, the gray medium ones basically stick out in either one of those populations. So they will be selected against, while the white and black furs will be selected for, disrupting the middle and selecting for the two extremes, the white and the black fur. That is disruptive selection. So again, three ways that natural selection can affect a population. How you can tell natural selection is happening in a population by looking at a graph of the traits. Again, stabilizing selection selects for the middle. Disruption selection is the opposite of that. It selects for the two extremes. And then directional selection selects for one extreme over the other. Next up, let's talk about the other ways that evolution can happen, because so far all we've talked about really is natural selection. And natural selection is one of the main ways that evolution has been known to happen in populations, but it is not exclusively the only way. So, a couple other ones to throw your way. The first one is gene flow. Gene flow is the movement of alleles between populations. Gene flow occurs when new individuals either join a population or leave a population. The key thing is wherever they end up, they need to mate in that population and reproduce. So there can be a mixing or interspersing of the genes. Um, High gene flow basically keeps neighboring populations similar, because if there is reproduction between those neighboring populations, that means they're sharing genes and they're not becoming isolated. And if there's a low gene flow, that increases the chance that two neighboring populations will evolve into different species, because if they're not sharing genes, there's a chance that they diverge because of mutations and sexual reproduction. So gene flow, movement of alleles into populations. Next one is called genetic drift. Genetic drift is the change in allele frequency due to chance. Right. So if we're looking at a population, let's just say a population of birds, and you're looking at one trait, let's just say beak size. The allele frequency is how often the certain alleles show up, right? How often does the allele for a large beak show up, the allele for a medium beak, the allele for a small beak, right? How often do they show up in that population is the allele frequency. So what happens in genetic drift is it causes a change in the genetic diversity. There are a few ways it can happen, but it is always a chance event. So the first example is called a bottleneck effect. Bottleneck effect happens when the size of a population drastically reduces in size. And so generally what happens is the leftover population has a lower genetic diversity than the original population that it came from. So if you imagine the scenario where there's a bottle and a whole bunch of different beans in there, and the population's like 50% green beans, 30% of these yellow ones, and like 10 to 20% of these red ones. If you imagine shaking it up and passing them through a bottle and just allowing some of them to survive, the surviving population does not have the same genetic diversity as the original population. That is a bottleneck effect. It can be caused by a natural disaster, a mass dying off, deforestation, something like that, that can cause the population to dramatically decrease. Another example of how a population can dramatically decrease is called the founder's effect. The founder's effect happens when a small population starts a new population in a different area. And that small population generally does not have the same genetic diversity as the original population it came from. You see an example here with a bird relocating flowers to a new field, or just picked up a couple, started a new population, and then didn't have the genetic diversity that the whole original population had. This is a reason why people who live in Amish and Mennonite communities generally have a very low genetic diversity, because they fall under what's known as the founder's effect. They were founded by just a few small members, 100 members or so, moved to these isolated communities, and there's just reproduction of those members in those isolated communities. Even though they're a human population, the human population is really genetically diverse. They came from just a small section of that human population, bringing just a small amount of genetic diversity with them. So when they started their new little communities, they didn't have the genetic diversity that the whole human population had. That is genetic drift. Generally, genetic drift has a negative effect on a population, because you are decreasing the genetic diversity in that population. So it's less likely that some individuals can adapt, and harmful alleles can become more common in these populations because there's less genetic diversity. Next up is sexual selection. Sexual selection occurs when certain traits increase the chance of successful mating. Generally, this happens because there is a higher cost of reproduction for females than there is for males. And so males have to continuously compete either for access to females or for the right to mate with them. And so Because of that, we have this situation called sexual selection, where you can have situations like these elephant seals, where males will compete um, amongst themselves for access to the females. That's called intrasexual selection. Males fight, the winner basically gets the chance to mate with the female. That's a little different than intersexual selection, where males display certain traits to try to display their good genes and attractiveness to the females. That's like what we see in peacocks, where they display these beautiful feathers to try to attract the peahen who has none of those feathers. The whole point is that these feathers give it a better chance to reproduce, and the peacocks with the best feathers will be the ones that get to reproduce with the peahens. Um, that's sexual selection. So, if we're wrapping up our conversation on these other mechanisms of evolution, we should be able to compile a list of the way that species evolve. And that's what I have here, right? So, the main ways that populations have been known to evolve, right? There's still a couple others that we haven't discussed, but these are the five main ways. Natural selection, which we've talked about in depth, mutations, like you saw in the lab that we did, gene flow, genetic drift, and sexual selection. So those are the five main ways that populations evolve: natural selection, mutations, gene flow, genetic drift, and sexual selection. So let's transition to talk a little bit about what happens when species evolve so much that they actually turn into different species. And that process is called speciation. Um, What happens in speciation is that there's generally a rise in two or more species from an existing species. Um, and it happens generally because populations of animals can become isolated from each other when there's no gene flow. And so these isolated populations start to adapt to their own environments, and genetic differences add up after generation to generation to generation. And so eventually that can lead to the formation of those species becoming two distinctly separate species. Um, and so speciation is only possible if there is reproductive isolation. And reproductive isolation is basically when members of different populations can no longer successfully mate together. Because they can no longer successfully mate together, there is no sharing of genes. No sharing of genes means that those populations have completely evolved away from each other. And this reproductive isolation can be caused by three other types of isolation. And so, if we're kind of working our way backwards here in this process, speciation is the word that helps to Speciation is the word that describes the separation of two species because they have evolved to be so different from each other. Before speciation is reproductive isolation, where they can no longer mate together. And then reproductive isolation can be caused by three different types of isolation: behavioral, temporal, and geographic isolation. So let's attack a couple of them here, right? Behavioral isolation is basically when there is a difference in courtship and mating behaviors. Um, these species have different rituals to attract their mates, whether it's like a courtship dance, a song, any kind of ritual. If they do not have the same type of ritual, that means they can't attract the same members of the population. That's behavioral isolation. All of these are different types of birds, but their courtship rituals are significantly different. You're not going to see a bird of paradise mate with a swan because their reproductive and um, mating and courtship behaviors are not the same. Next is geographic isolation. Geographic isolation occurs when there's a literal physical barrier that separates the populations from each other. There is a river that runs through an area where they both used to live, and now they're separated by that river. A mountain deforestation is a big one for this, right? If they were connected all in the forest and one portion is cleared out and now there are two separate pods in a forest, there's a geographical barrier between those two populations. And then the final one is called temporal isolation. Temporal isolation has to do with time. Um, And so if the timing of the reproductive periods of animals don't match up, they're not going to be able to reproduce together. If one reproduces in the spring and the other one reproduces in the summer, if they're not ready to reproduce at the same time, they have this temporal isolation and they don't mate together. And so all of those together, temporal, geographic, and behavioral isolation, can all lead to reproductive isolation. Reproductive isolation is when they can no longer mate together. If they can't mate together, and if that continues for a certain amount of time, that reproductive isolation can turn into speciation, where now they've turned into two separate species. That is the end of our notes. Thank you for watching.